Hey everyone, welcome to our Theolog for today on chapter 13 of The Reason for God. And today, this is one of my favorite chapters in the book because this is one of the chapters that was really important in my life when I was reading this book because it really brought everything together. So in this chapter today, we talk about the resurrection, and Tim Keller makes a really good case for the resurrection being a historical event that actually happened, or at least that people thought it happened, right? And that's pretty big deal because the crucifixion is really important. We talked about it yesterday, but there's almost universal consensus that the crucifixion happened, right? Both from Christian belief, obviously, but also from secular scholars who aren't Christian. Pretty much everything that people know, or they'll say we can know about Jesus, is that he was teaching in the first century, that he made someone mad, and that he was crucified for it. And that's what even like secular people will say. Now, obviously, the biggest break is with the resurrection, right? Because that's like the real crux of the whole thing. Because obviously, everything's rooted in the resurrection. Paul says, if there was no resurrection, then our faith is in vain. Then we hope in vain, right? So it's all these types of things. It's really, really important. And so we need to have a good understanding of, or a good argument as to why the resurrection occurred or happened. And I think a really good, Tim Keller brings up a lot of them. He brings up the transmission thing, right? That Paul talks about people he heard it from, and that, it could have been, it couldn't have been fabricated because people knew who these people were. And it happened pretty recently after Jesus' death, right? But my favorite argument that he brings up is the one about women. So when you look at being a history guy myself, everything that is written down is curated in some way, unless it's a really first-hand account like someone's journal or something where they're not expecting other people to read it. And so when you write something to go out to a general public, we do this today, right? You want to soften the things that make you look bad, and you want to push forward the things that make you look really good, right? So if you were a political candidate today and you were writing out your platform or whatever, you're not going to talk about all the bad stuff you've done, right? All the times you haven't lived up to your promises. You're going to bring up the good stuff. But what this does by including women is the first witnesses to the resurrection. What that does is it makes Christianity seem illegitimate in the first century, right? So not only to a Jewish audience who did not take women's testimony in court at the same level that they would a man's testimony. Same thing in the Roman Empire, right? In general, it was much more patriarchal, and women weren't as trusted. So the fact that the first witnesses to the resurrection are 3 women, and then they have to go and tell the apostles, is a really good case for the resurrection. I'm going to read what Tim Keller has to say about that, and then I'll give more comments. So Tim Keller writes, additionally, the accounts of the resurrection in the Bible were too problematic to be fabrications. Each gospel states that the first witnesses to the resurrection were women. Women's low social status meant that their testimony was not admissible evidence in court. There was no possible advantage to the church to recount that all of the first witnesses were women. It could only have undermined the credibility of the testimony. The only possible explanation for why women were depicted as meeting Jesus first is if they really had, N.T. Wright argues, that there must have been an enormous pressure on the early proclaimers of the Christian message to remove the women from the accounts. They felt they could not do so. The records were too well known. So, like, when we talk about telling whether or not a source is true in history, we have something that's called the criterion of embarrassment, or the criteria of embarrassment. So if it's an embarrassing thing to the person and they write it in there, then it probably happened, because the logic goes that if you were going to lie about something, you would lie about the things that are embarrassing, right? And so today we wouldn't see anything odd about women being the first ones to reach there, right? We would see it kind of in line with the rest of the Gospels, where women play a pretty important role. But in the first century, if the most important thing about your faith is the fact that this guy resurrected, and the first 3 people to witness it were women who were considered not reliable witnesses, why would you include that in there? Why wouldn't you change it to Peter, John, and James, or something like that, right? Someone who were respected in the early church, because that didn't happen, right? And people knew it didn't happen. The apostles knew it didn't happen that way. And so even if you wanted to change it, you would. I think like you can see this in other religious movements, right? Where they will write these kind of embarrassing or they'll have embarrassing origins, and then someone in the future will go back and be like, well, we've expunged that, or that's not really what happened, this is what happened, and they'll put forward their own thing. Well, Christianity doesn't really do that. It really rests in the embarrassment that a lot of the people are. I think Peter is a good example of this, right? The best disciple is always messing up. Paul is a good example of this, right? He persecuted the early church. They don't write that out, even though he's very important. So it's stuff like that that's great. And I think that this is a really good case for the resurrection, or one of the good cases for the resurrection. So I want to talk about that. If you want to see the other ones he makes, you can read the actual chapter, chapter 13. But yeah, that's what I want to talk about today. I hope this has been interesting for you. I will see you on Sunday at our service, and then Monday for our next Theolog. So I will see you then.